Clint Eastwood sat comfortably in his first-class seat, gazing out the window as the plane taxied toward the runway. The hum of the engines vibrated through the cabin, a familiar sound he had heard countless times before. He adjusted the simple silver cross hanging around his neck, a quiet symbol of faith he had worn for decades. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, performing their final checks, their professional smiles masking the routine exhaustion of their work. Clint leaned back, his eyes scanning the cabin, taking in the quiet murmurs of passengers settling in for the flight. The air smelled of recycled oxygen and faint traces of cologne and coffee. Just as he closed his eyes, letting the rhythm of the aircraft soothe him into a moment of peace, a presence loomed over him. He opened his eyes to see a young flight attendant standing beside his seat, her uniform pristine, her expression composed but firm. "Excuse me, Mr. Eastwood," she said in a controlled, almost rehearsed tone. "I'm going to have to ask you to remove that necklace before we take off." Clint blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. He tilted his head slightly, studying her face, searching for any sign of humor or mistake. "Come again," he asked, his voice calm but carrying the weight of decades of experience in dealing with situations that didn't sit right with him. "Your necklace, sir," she repeated, her voice a touch more insistent. "We have a strict policy on this flight regarding religious symbols. I'm going to need you to remove it." Clint felt a slow burn rise in his chest, a mixture of confusion and irritation. "That's a first," he said, his voice even but carrying the sharp edge of disbelief. "I've been on more flights than I can count, and I've never heard of such a rule." The attendant's smile didn't waver, but her eyes held a flicker of something, nervousness, perhaps. "It's a policy our airline has recently implemented," she explained. "We strive to maintain a neutral environment for all passengers." Clint let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Neutral," he repeated. "Lady, it's a cross. It's not a billboard. I'm not preaching from the aisle." The attendant's polite demeanor remained intact, but there was a shift in her stance, a stiffening of her shoulders. "I understand, Mr. Eastwood, but I must insist. We can't take off until you comply." Clint exhaled slowly, rubbing his fingers together in thought. He wasn't one to cause unnecessary trouble, but something about this didn't sit right with him. He had lived long enough to recognize when something was off. He glanced around the cabin. A few passengers had started to take notice, their gazes flickering toward the exchange with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "And if I refuse?" Clint asked, his voice carrying the quiet intensity that had defined so many of his iconic roles. The flight attendant hesitated, but only for a moment. "Then I will have to escalate this to security," she said. "Sir, please don't make this difficult." Clint studied her, his jaw tightening. He had faced down men with guns, had walked through wars both real and cinematic, and yet here he was, being told to remove a cross because it somehow disrupted the fragile balance of neutrality on a commercial flight. He reached up, touching the cross lightly with his fingertips. It wasn't about the necklace itself. It was about something deeper, something that gnawed at the edges of his patience. The rules were changing, and not in ways that made sense. He sighed, shifting in his seat, preparing to respond. But before he could speak, another figure approached, the lead flight attendant, older, with a sterner expression. "Reinforcements." The situation was escalating faster than he expected. Clint Eastwood stared at the flight attendant, his jaw tightening as the weight of the situation settled in. He had dealt with a lot in his lifetime, Hollywood politics, real-life threats, the kind of nonsense that came with fame, but this? This was something else entirely. "I'm not taking it off," he said, his voice calm but firm, his eyes locked onto hers. There was no anger, just a quiet, unshakable certainty. The flight attendant's pleasant mask wavered for a fraction of a second before she straightened, pressing her lips into a thin line. "Mr. Eastwood, please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." Clint exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Lady, I'm sitting here, minding my own business. I'm not bothering anyone. This cross has been around my neck longer than you've probably been alive. And I'll be damned if I take it off just because some airline decided faith is a problem." The murmur of the cabin had shifted. People were watching now. Not openly, no one wanted to get involved, but he could feel the weight of their glances, the tension thickening the air. The flight attendant hesitated, then straightened, making her decision. She turned slightly, lifting a hand to signal to someone near the front of the plane. Within seconds, 2 uniformed security officers moved down the aisle with the kind of detached authority Clint had seen too many times before. They weren't looking for a discussion. They were looking to remove a problem. And right now, that problem was him. "Mr. Eastwood," one of them said, his voice level but unmistakably firm. "We need you to comply with airline policy." Clint's eyes flickered between the 2 men. He could see it, the rehearsed routine, the expectation that he would back down, that he would make it easy. But he wasn't built for that. "Not happening," Clint said simply. The second officer, broader, shifted slightly. "Sir, we're going to have to ask you to step off the plane." Clint let out a short, humorless laugh. "For wearing a cross? You guys serious?" The first officer sighed, glancing at the flight attendant as if confirming the order. Then, without another word, he reached forward, his fingers closing around the chain of the cross. Clint's hand shot up, instinct taking over, grabbing the man's wrist before he could yank it away. The sudden movement sent a ripple through the passengers, gasping, shifting, murmuring. The second officer reacted instantly, gripping Clint's other arm with more force than necessary. "Don't," Clint warned, his voice dangerously low. But it didn't matter. The first officer twisted the chain, snapping it free from Clint's neck in a swift, practiced motion. The metal dug into his skin for a brief second before the cross was ripped away. A strange silence followed. Clint sat there, breathing evenly, his hands curled into fists, his pulse a steady thrum of restrained fury. The flight attendant took a small step back, avoiding his gaze. "Let's go," the second officer said. Clint didn't move. Not at first. His eyes stayed on the stolen cross, now dangling from the officer's fingers. Then, without a word, he pushed himself up, his movements slow, deliberate. He didn't fight them as they gripped his arms, guiding him toward the front of the plane. He didn't say a word as they led him down the jet bridge, the cold air of the terminal hitting his skin like an insult. Only when they were back in the airport, away from the plane, did he finally speak. "Give it back," he said, his voice like gravel. The officer holding the cross barely glanced at him. "It's confiscated," he said. "Airline policy." Clint's fingers twitched at his side, his restraint wearing thin. "It's mine," he said. "You have no right, sir," the officer interrupted. "If you continue causing a disturbance, we'll have to take further action." Clint let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He turned, walking away without another word. But the fire in his chest was only getting stronger. He pulled his phone from his pocket, dialing a number with practiced ease. "Get over here," he said as soon as the line picked up. "Now." Minutes later, his security team arrived. They moved fast, no wasted motions, no questions. Clint didn't have to explain, one look at his face, and they understood. The officers barely had time to react before his men closed in. One of them stepped forward, his expression blank but his intent crystal clear. "Hand it over," he said. The officer hesitated, but only for a moment. Something about the way Clint's men moved, the quiet efficiency, the unspoken authority, made it clear that resistance wasn't an option. The cross was placed back into Clint's waiting palm without another word. He stared at it for a second, then clasped it back around his neck where it belonged. He didn't thank them. He didn't acknowledge them. He just turned and walked away, the cold steel pressing against his skin, a silent promise that this wasn't the end of it. Clint Eastwood never forgot that flight, but more importantly, he never forgot the way they had treated him. He had spent his life playing men who stood their ground, men who refused to be pushed around, and now reality had decided to test whether he could live up to that image. For months, he avoided that airline. He had the means to fly private whenever he wanted, and after what had happened, he saw no reason to set foot on one of their planes again. Every time he saw a news report about increasing restrictions, about personal freedoms being pushed aside in the name of neutrality, he felt that old fire stir inside him again. But he let it be. For a while. Until one day, curiosity, or maybe something deeper, got the better of him. He found himself booking another flight, this time deliberately choosing that same airline. He wasn't sure why. Maybe he wanted to see if they had learned anything. Maybe he just wanted to prove to himself that they couldn't keep him away. Either way, when he stepped onto the plane, there was an immediate shift in the air. A few of the flight attendants stole glances at him, whispering amongst themselves. He ignored them, walking to his seat with the quiet confidence that had been his trademark for decades. He sat down, adjusting his jacket, and let out a slow breath. It felt the same as before, the hum of the engines, the quiet murmur of passengers settling in, the sterile scent of the cabin. But this time, there was no tension in his chest. If they tried something again, he would be ready. He wasn't the kind of man who let history repeat itself. Then, as if on cue, she appeared. The same flight attendant. The one who had started it all. Their eyes met, and he saw it immediately, the flicker of recognition, the way her breath caught just slightly before she composed herself. But it was there. She remembered. And she looked ashamed. For a long moment, she just stood there, as if debating whether to say anything at all. Then, finally, she took a slow step forward. "Mr. Eastwood," she said, her voice softer than before. Not rehearsed. Not forced. Just human. He didn't say anything, just watched her. She swallowed, glancing at the silver cross still hanging around his neck. It was there, just as before, a quiet defiance against the moment they had taken from him. She hesitated, then sighed. "I want to apologize. For what happened last time." Clint raised an eyebrow slightly. He hadn't expected that. "That's so," he said, his voice even. She nodded, shifting awkwardly. "I shouldn't have handled it that way. I was just following policy, but it wasn't right." Clint studied her for a moment, letting her words sit between them. He could see it in her face. This wasn't some corporate-mandated apology. This was real. And real was rare these days. "What changed?" he asked finally. She hesitated, then glanced around as if making sure no one else was listening. "You did," she admitted. "After that flight, people started talking. Some agreed with what happened. Others didn't. It made me think about what's right and what's just rules." Clint let out a quiet breath, nodding slightly. He had seen this before. People who followed orders without question, until something made them realize they had a choice. He had played that role himself, on screen and off. He respected it. The ability to recognize when you'd been wrong. "Well," he said finally, "takes guts to admit that." She offered a small, uncertain smile. "I just wanted you to know. And I hope this flight is better than the last one." Clint smirked slightly. "Can't be much worse." That made her laugh, a Real laugh, not the practiced, polite kind flight attendants gave to passengers. She nodded once, then straightened. "If you need anything, just let me know." Then she turned and walked away, back to her duties. Clint watched her go, then glanced down at the cross resting against his chest. Maybe some people could change after all. He leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes as the plane began to taxi down the runway. This time, when he flew, he did it on his own terms. And that was the only way he ever would. The flight landed smoothly, the familiar jolt of the wheels meeting the runway barely registering as Clint Eastwood opened his eyes. He had spent most of the flight in quiet contemplation, not because he was particularly deep in thought, but because there was something strangely peaceful about the whole experience. No tension. No conflict. Just a flight, the way it was supposed to be. As the passengers began gathering their belongings, stretching their legs, and preparing to disembark, Clint took his time. He wasn't in a hurry. He never was. He waited until most of the crowd had filed out before standing, adjusting his jacket, and stepping into the aisle. And then, there she was again, the same flight attendant, standing near the exit, watching him with something unreadable in her eyes. He stopped in front of her, tilting his head slightly. "You always work this route?" he asked. She smiled, a little more relaxed now. "More often than not." Clint considered that for a moment, then nodded. "You got time for a coffee?" She blinked, as if caught off guard by the question. "Coffee?" "Yeah," Clint said. "Just a conversation. No policies. No rules. Just two people talking." She hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Yeah, I think I'd like that." They stepped off the plane together, moving through the terminal, blending into the crowd like any other travelers. It was an odd thing, how quickly life could shift from tension to something close to camaraderie. They found a small cafe near the gate, tucked away from the heavier foot traffic. Clint ordered black coffee, as he always did. She got something with too many syllables for him to bother remembering. They sat across from each other at a small table by the window, watching the endless motion of people coming and going. For a while, neither of them spoke. It wasn't uncomfortable, just quiet. And Clint appreciated quiet. Finally, she sighed, wrapping her hands around her cup. "I meant what I said," she told him. "About being sorry." Clint nodded. "I know." She studied him for a moment, then shook her head, smiling faintly. "You really don't let things go, do you?" "Not when they matter," Clint admitted. "You ever think about why you did it?" "The cross thing." She sighed, tapping her fingers against the side of her cup. "I guess I thought I was just doing my job. But the more I think about it, the more I realize that's just an excuse. Doing your job doesn't mean you stop thinking for yourself." Clint smirked slightly. "Now you sound like one of my old scripts." She laughed. "Maybe. But I think it's true." He nodded, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "You got a good head on your shoulders," he said after a moment. "Just gotta remember to use it." "And be kinder," she added. He raised an eyebrow. "I say that." "Not yet," she said, smirking. "But I feel like you were about to." Clint chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, well, doesn't hurt." She smiled at that, and for the first time, Clint saw something lighter in her expression. Maybe it was relief. Maybe it was just the simple act of two people understanding each other. Either way, he didn't mind it. They finished their coffee, and when it was time to go, she hesitated. "You flying with us again?" she asked. Clint thought about it, then shrugged. "Maybe." And he did. Not right away, but eventually. And when he did, she was there. Every time. They never spoke about that first flight again. They didn't have to. Some things just became part of the past. What mattered was the present. And in the present, Clint Eastwood had a favorite airline.